one of the past that they actually stand around in a circle and have a moaning sound that they emit. Every time they pass that.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the panel discussion on human sacrifice and capital punishment. First of all, thank you for taking the time out of your very busy schedules to come all the way to Dwarka. We understand this very far, and participate in this discussion. So the panel discussion is the first of many interdisciplinary events that we have planned that aim to critically engage with the death penalty and other forms of extreme punishment. Through these events, we hope to bring perspectives from the social and behavioral sciences to the forefront and facilitate conversations that critically examine the most fundamental assumptions about capital punishment. Additionally, we hope that these conversations help in debunking the belief that the legal system should be left to its own devices in dealing with matters related to the death penalty. Let me begin by briefly introducing the work of the Center. The Center on the Death Penalty was started in August 2014 with the aim of shining a light into the death penalty system through empirical research and providing effective legal representation to indigent death row prisoners. But really, the cornerstone of the Center was established in 2016 with the publication of the Death Penalty India report. The report is based on data gathered by the Death Penalty Research Project team, some of whom are in the audience today. The team interviewed 375 out of 383 prisoners on death row at the time, spoke to their families, spoke to their lawyers, documented their socio-economic profiles, and mapped their complex interaction with the criminal justice system. Because of the efforts of this team, we are here today. The center is currently comprised of a team of 15 working across 3 departments: research, litigation, and public affairs. And we have 3 administrative officers. Since mid-2016, the research department has been conducting a nationwide mental health research project in consultation with NIMHANS Bangalore. The project interviews death row prisoners and their families across the country to document the prevalence of mental illness and intellectual disability, and really to understand the lived experience of what it means to be under the sentence of death. At this time, we have interviewed 80 prisoners across Chhattisgarh, Karnataka, Kerala, and Madhya Pradesh. Dr. Sanjeev Jain, who I will properly introduce in just a moment, is one of our 3 consultant mental health experts from NIMHANS Bangalore. Dr. Anup Dar, who is in the audience today, is a core member of the project's ethics committee. And the project team comprises of Ms. Maitri Mishra, Ms. Angela Joseph, and a large number of dedicated student volunteers, many of whom are in the audience today, and myself. In November 2016, the project team interviewed a married couple, Ishwari and Kiran, who are currently lodged in Central Prison, Raipur. They had both been sentenced to death in 2014 for the alleged human sacrifice of a 2-year-old boy. The complex cultural, psychological, and legal dimensions of their case prompted us to think about the fault lines that emerge when courts rely on the death penalty to punish acts of human sacrifice. Our questions took a more pragmatic turn as the center decided to take up Ishwari and Kiran's case and represent them before the Supreme Court. The purpose of this panel discussion is to begin the set of conversations that will allow us to examine these fault lines through the lenses of anthropology, psychiatry, and criminal law. In this regard, it would be an understatement to say that our panelists, Dr. Felix Padel, Dr. Sanjeev Jain, and Ms. Rebecca John, are well placed to guide this discussion. Let me begin by introducing Dr. Felix Padel. So Dr. Padel is an anthropologist, writer, musician, and activist. He was born in London but has been living in India for over 30 years. He's been a student at both Oxford and Delhi University and has degrees in sociology, anthropology, and social anthropology. He has worked with multiple tribes in eastern India, including the Dongriya Kond, and has written 3 books: Sacrificing People, Invasions of a Tribal Landscape, followed by Out of This Earth, East India Adivasis and the Aluminum Cartel, and Ecology, Economy, Quest for a Socially Informed Connection. He has in recent years been a professor at the School of Rural Management at the Indian Institute of Health Management Research, Jaipur, and visiting faculty at JNU. Dr. Sanjeev Jain is a professor of psychiatry at NIMHANS Bangalore. one of his many research interests is the genetic basis of psychiatric and neurological disease. Dr. Jain has been involved with volunteer work with both governmental organizations and NGOs, and was a member of the committee for drafting the mental health policy document for India. He has been researching the history of mental health services in India, from the colonial to the contemporary period. His work contributes significantly to the interface between science and medicine and social responses to mental illness in India. A third panelist is Ms. Rebecca John. Ms. John has been practicing criminal law since 1988. She was designated senior advocate in February 2013 by the High Court of Delhi, the first female criminal lawyer to be designated so. She has appeared for the victims of the Hashimpura massacre of 1986 and the victims of the 1984 anti-Sikh riots. She has also appeared for several survivors of rape and acid attacks in their pursuit for justice. As a trustee of Partners for Law and Development, she has dealt with legal issues involving the rights of some of the most marginalized communities in the country. She is also a founder member of Women in Law and Litigation. Additionally, Ms. John is the arguing counsel for Ishwari in Ishwari and Kiran's case. So before I hand the discussion over to the panel, I'd like to take some time to lay out the context of this discussion and foreground at least some of the theoretical underpinnings of what it means to have a jurisprudence of human sacrifice and capital punishment. So this discussion is situated squarely in between two discrete yet interlinked superstitious belief systems. One, the set of beliefs that lead cults to commit homicide in order to appease a deity. And two, the set of beliefs that lead courts to insist on the commission of homicide in order to serve the ends of justice. At its core, this endeavor is about pushing forward the enterprise of understanding violence, understanding the law's reaction to violence, and understanding what the law's reaction to violence ought and ought not to be. To say that an act does not deserve the death penalty is not to say that the act does not deserve to be punished. It is, however, to assert the fact that the death penalty is consistently the worst possible punitive reaction to any act of violence. It does not cure, it does not deter, it does not heal, and it is to say that the ritual murder of a human being by the state is no solution to the ritual murder of a human being by a cult. The story of Ishwari and Kiran also lies squarely in between the realms of cult sacrifice and juridical sacrifice. This is a story that we will be constrained to hear, unfortunately, primarily from the version of events used by the sentencing court that confirmed Ishwari and Kiran's death sentence. A few biographical details first. Ishwari and Kiran are both from Ruabanda, a slum in the Durg district of Chhattisgarh, an industrial district. Ishwari is 42 years old and Kiran is 37. They have been married to each other for around 19 years and they have 3 children. Ishwari is a self-professed faith healer. Although his parents are farmers, Ishwari, who stopped going to school in 4th standard, learned Jad Funk, or faith healing, from his grandfather, who was a traditional healer. In his own words, "My dada used to practice Jad Funk in the village as there was no doctor. Our village was like a jungle. I learned by observing him as a child. I used to go to the jungle to learn under him, and slowly, I began to understand the ways of Jad Funk." Kiran used to assist Ishwari in his faith healing, although she herself was never initiated into this system of knowledge. Now we come to the alleged events that the trial court and the High Court relied on when sentencing Ishwari and Kiran to death. In 2010, goddess Kali appeared to Kiran in a vision and demanded an offering of blood from her. The deity told her that she would attain Siddhi if she did this. Kiran takes this to mean that if she does not perform a human sacrifice, an evil shadow will befall her family. Kiran informs Ishwari about her dream, and he in turn instructs his disciples to capture a young child to be sacrificed. A 2-year-old boy was chosen and brought to Ishwari's house. Ishwari, Kiran, and 5 of their disciples cut off the tongue and cheeks of the boy. They behead him and bury his head and tongue under a makeshift mud altar inside the house. A mob entered the house in search of the missing child. They dug up the altar and found the severed head of the child inside it. Ishwari and Kiran confessed immediately that they had sacrificed the child to the goddess and begged the mob for mercy. Ishwari, Kiran, their 3 children, and the 5 disciples are arrested by the police shortly thereafter. The trial court sentenced Ishwari and Kiran to death, and the Chhattisgarh High Court confirmed the death sentence. While acknowledging that they belong to the poorest sections of society and are illiterate, the confirming judge characterized the motive of attaining Siddhi as the pursuit of an unquenchable lust for power. He labeled them intelligent and diabolical human beings who know how to wield power. They were considered to be so thoroughly steeped in their superstition that they are incapable completely and utterly of reform. They were considered to be so immersed in their beliefs that the young age of the victim did not arouse sympathy in them. The sacrifice and the rituals surrounding the sacrifice were described as depraved, grotesque, revolting, and therefore amounting to a crime of the rarest of the rare nature. The judgment also emphasizes that the death penalty is necessary to send out a strong message against child sacrifice to discourage would-be perpetrators. The confirmation of death sentence by the Chhattisgarh High Court came barely a month after we had actually met these people, after we had interviewed them and spent a lot of time talking to them. We became a little obsessed with this case, really. And then we started to gather as much information as possible about something that we really didn't know anything about, which is human sacrifice, the culture behind human sacrifice, the psychology behind human sacrifice. We started by compiling newspaper articles on contemporary instances of human sacrifice in India. To our surprise, we actually came across dozens and dozens of newspaper articles that reported on such events and incidents, particularly child sacrifices across the country. A selection of these newspaper reports are in the documents in front of you. While there have been successful attempts at documenting the practice of witch hunting across India, human sacrifice is on the rather empirically neglected end of the spectrum. However, even the sparse data that is available points to a significant phenomenon that warrants further study. NCRB data shows that between 2010 to 2014, 16 cases of human sacrifice were reported, out of which Jharkhand, Andhra Pradesh, Karnataka, Madhya Pradesh, Punjab, Uttar Pradesh, and West Bengal account for 75% of these cases. 7 cases of murder involving human sacrifice were registered in the first year of the Maharashtra Prevention and Eradication of Human Sacrifice Act of 2013. Since there has been no empirical study investigating the most common beliefs and consequently the most common motives associated with contemporary human sacrifice in India, the newspaper reports we collected has proven to be somewhat useful in understanding just the lay of the land. In these reports, the stated motives of the sacrificers range from curing mental illnesses, putting an end to horrifically violent dreams, ensuring better harvests for the crops, finding hidden treasures under houses, finding a lost mobile phone, and ensuring fertility for childbirth. Most of the reports across the country point to impoverished people who conduct human sacrifices seemingly to plead deities, most often goddess Kali, to bless them with the things that they see privileged people having a superabundance of, namely health, wealth, and luck. Delusion and conviction, powerlessness and power, marginalization, and taking one's destiny into one's own hands are just some of the dichotomies that seem to operate behind a typical sacrifice, one that is so easily dismissed as a barbaric act. 1. It appears that human sacrifice is a last-ditch attempt to escape dire circumstances. The following quote from an anthropologist at LSE who spent a lot of time conducting fieldwork in Bhilai, Chhattisgarh, Dr. Jonathan Parry, brings some of the sociological landscapes behind human sacrifice into perspective. The deities ride the machines and won't let them work. They demand balis, which have to be provided to keep the gods happy. Often, they make the requirements known by appearing in the dreams of the owner. And sometimes they demand a price that they're unwilling to pay. There was a paint factory on the Bilai industrial estate that had to close down because its owner had learned that the offering that was required was none other than his only son. But the deities are usually more reasonable than that, and it's probably wise to indulge them. If their demands are unmet, one fatal accident follows another. In Bali, there is usually just one victim. So in the end, human sacrifice is more economical of human life. It's almost a safety measure, says Jonathan Parry. But the courts that confirm death sentences for human sacrificers are seldom interested in the nuance of their beliefs or their backstories. That much is clear from a brief overview of the death penalty cases involving human sacrifice. In Sushil Murmu versus State of Jharkhand, the Supreme Court held that anyone who commits an act of human sacrifice should by default be considered incapable of reform, since they do not possess the basic human quality, since they do not possess basic humanness, they are automatically disqualified from having a psyche for reformation. While such statements are actually quite commonplace in death penalty sentencing, they're especially problematic when it comes to human sacrifice cases. Alleged perpetrators in these cases are considered simultaneously to be profoundly ignorant of their actions, but also to be deeply sinister because of their beliefs. The court forcefully imposes accusations of savagery, enmity to modernity, and an incurable strain of amorality to these sacrificers. This serves, in a way, to dehumanize the perpetrators. It's a performative act to dehumanize the perpetrators enough to be able to justify capital punishment. On the other hand, even while commuting the death sentences of the alleged perpetrators of human sacrifice, courts tend to caricature them as entities who are absolutely less than human, whose only mitigating feature really is their own seepage in barbarism. In State of Maharashtra versus Damu, the Supreme Court commuted the death sentence of the accused who had sacrificed 5 children to uncover a hidden treasure. But the court said that it is their utter ignorance that makes them so gullible to such superstitious thinking. This approach does have a benefit, a cynical benefit, which is that it places alternative belief in some way or other within a mitigating framework. But it does not even begin to scratch the surface and does not even want to scratch the surface of the complex cultural and psychological dimensions behind ritualistic crime. Amidst the bleakness of the jurisprudence comes the 2013 High Court case of State versus Jitendra. In Jitendra, the accused allegedly beheaded his father and offered his head as a sacrifice under the belief that he would gain divine powers. In the court's discussion on irrational belief systems, the judgment refers to an epistemic rift that operates when modern minds attempt to comprehend primitive practice. The court states that while superstitious beliefs and practices may seem abhorrent to rational minds, they are real and offer the promise of benefits to those who believe in them. The judgment also, very interestingly, suggests a correlation between widespread illiteracy and the deep-rootedness of superstitious beliefs, a correlation that the Supreme Court should have very much acted on in Ishwari and Kiran. So because of this correlation that the High Court draws so concretely, it reinforces the obligation of sentencing courts to carefully examine the socio-economic circumstances of the accused. But most significantly, in my opinion, the court highlights that in these cases, the accused should be referred for a medical checkup in order to rule out the possibility of a mental illness. Although somewhat out of line with the less progressive jurisprudence of the Supreme Court on the matter, the High Court has created a leeway, however small, for cultural and psychological factors to be considered when deciding a case of human sacrifice. At this juncture, it is imperative for the social and behavioral sciences to expand this leeway, to occupy this space, to drive the capital jurisprudence on human sacrifice forward. A timely set of interventions have the potential to push the envelope on a range of issues of death penalty sentencing, including culpability, capacity for reform, mitigation, and most fundamentally, the way courts use cultural and psychological knowledge when it comes to ritualistic crime. With 3 executions carried out in just the last 5 years, and the recent Supreme Court confirmation of the accused in the December 16 gang rape case, capital jurisprudence in India is in a dangerous place. Capital punishment too has taken on the form of a mystical cure-all, much like human sacrifice, a snake oil that purports to remedy the deep structural issues that reproduce violence in society. The misunderstanding of ritualistic violence by courts is fundamentally linked to other failings of the death penalty sentencing court and the system, such as the failure to comprehensively grapple with mitigating factors, the failure to take mental health issues seriously, the failure to holistically understand the cultural location of the accused, the failure to consider penological alternatives to the death penalty, and most fundamentally, a failure to understand the true nature of violence. This misunderstanding of violence becomes all too literal in human sacrifice cases. We don't need to look further than Ishwari and Kiran's case. The court refers to Ishwari and Kiran as individuals who know how to wield something it on its own accord quantifies as power. What is this power? It's well documented that many people who have belief in human sacrifice also understand them to be acts of spiritual fortification. The following excerpt from the volume 4 of the Encyclopedia of Forensic and Legal Medicine speaks to this idea. The significant ideology behind a sacrificial ritual is that blood consists of life energy, constituting the highest offering to the gods or ancestors. The idea of Shakti, which is divine power in Durga worship, too is well documented. It doesn't take a stretch of the imagination to understand the judge in Ishwari's case is referring to his own embedded notions of what Shakti or Siddhi is, and converting it into juridical language in order to color the motive of the sacrifice. This misunderstanding of psychology and culture therefore seems like it arises not out of oversight, but actually as an active component necessary for capital punishment sentencing in this case. If courts are truly serious about understanding the true nature of violence, and particularly violence in human sacrifice cases, they must turn to the texts that have most seriously taken up the enterprise of understanding ritualistic violence. This uphill struggle can only begin with those of us at the academy bringing these issues to the forefront of the death penalty discourse. Whether it's engaging with the great anthropologist Malinowski's idea that human sacrifice might be motivated by the reduction of anxiety under conditions of great risk and uncertainty, and what this idea means for, let's say, a mitigation exercise, or grappling with psychiatric case studies of ritual crimes committed in a state of shared delusions and its implications, for instance, for traditional models of criminal culpability. The urgent questions that need to be asked at this juncture are interdisciplinary. If they are not asked, with the judicial front being led by cases such as Sushil Murmu and the looming legislative danger of bills such as the Karnataka Prevention of Superstitious Practices Bill of 2013, which recommends the death penalty for human sacrifice cases, we will have to resign ourselves to a fate where alleged ritual murderers are ritually murdered to allegedly serve the ends of justice. With Ishwari and Kiran's case to be heard soon by the Supreme Court, and the recent death sentence of 7 alleged human sacrificers in Yavatmal, Maharashtra, there is no better time than now for this discussion. So with that, I'll just explain the format of the discussion very briefly. Each of the panelists will speak for 45 minutes each, and there will be a tea break after the first session. Dr. Padel will go first, and after lunch, we will open up the panel to questions and comments from the audience. So without anything further to do, I invite Dr. Padel to take us to the anthropology of human sacrifice.
Very much. Is it okay if I speak here? Can you all hear? I find it a very interesting day today, partly because my first book, which came out of my PhD, was about human sacrifice. So I started going into the subject very deeply more than 30 years ago. And I want to take you on a journey now to amplify what Peter has said, to really look at many, many different aspects of human sacrifice in relation to, as he said, human violence. To really... Oh, I'm sorry. Could you hear what I was saying so far? Okay. So, maybe I'll start just by saying it's a very tough subject. I mean, the cases of human sacrifice are obviously very, very disturbing cases to read and absorb. So, this is not a subject for the faint-hearted. And in a way, I'm very glad to be here sharing in a day that is devoted to people really taking these issues of human violence and human sacrifice seriously. I think I'll just start by introducing you to my research, because if you're going to understand anthropologically human sacrifice, it helps to look at one example of the custom that has been analysed in depth. So I wrote my PhD and I started my research about this tribal people in Orissa called the Khons. And in Fraser's book, The Golden Bough, which was the text for anthropology 100 years ago, whatever, several pages are devoted to the Khond human sacrifice custom. And so it's one of the best known cases of human sacrifice, best documented. I mean, I'm going to mention maybe dozens of other cases later. And maybe one of the starting points is to look at the belief systems that all the cases, I mean, as you all know, human sacrifice is something recurring quite often in different parts of India. It also happens in the West. For example, what's called satanic cults, where people actually reverse kind of Christianity and consider the devil as the supreme being or something, and then there are forms of human sacrifice and horrendous things that happen there too. But obviously in India these cases are quite common. But in most of the cases there is a big transformation from the original custom that I'm going to talk about. And I think if you want to encapsulate this difference, it's that the original Khond human sacrifice, in as much as we know what really happened in it, was a community event, and a large number of people, all the people in a village or set of villages, took part in it, took responsibility for it. While in most modern cases it's maybe what is called a tantric, or certain people for their own gain or well-being or psychic power or something, rather than a big kind of publicly recognized community thing. So I'll talk more about what this change means later. To summarize the evidence on the Khond human sacrifice, and which I would emphasize, almost every aspect of human sacrifice cannot be known for certain, because the filters are always what other people from different cultures are saying. So in the case of Fraser's evidence on human sacrifice, or the evidence collected by British officials, the filter was they had Oriya interpreters, Sepoys, and so on, local people who said, the people do this, they practice like this, they do it for this reason, and the British people mostly couldn't speak the Khond language, so how the Khonds themselves talked about it is an unknown. Similarly, for example, Elwin, one of the best-known anthropologists, he went to the Khond area. He was in villages where people said, yes, we really still regret not being able to do human sacrifice. The government has forbidden it, and we sacrifice buffaloes instead, but the earth goddess really still demands it, and that's why in the buffalo sacrifice, as we do it now, somebody always gets cut with an axe, and the Mother Earth demands that blood. Or so many kind of things like that you hear. But even there, I have Khond friends who deny that the whole thing is a figment of the colonial imagination. So it's very, very hard. And every single case of human sacrifice that you look at, it's the same kind of story. So if you look at the Khond case, the British discovered the custom in 1835, and within a few years they set up an agency for the suppression of human sacrifice in Orissa, which covered the Khonds, Orissa's largest tribe. There was, or is, about 1 million of them, so it covers quite a few districts in the middle of Orissa, towards the south. And this agency existed until the 1850s. So during that time, they suppressed the custom. And actually, it was the agency for the suppression of human sacrifice and female infanticide. So a smaller section of the Khonds didn't do human sacrifice, but they had female infanticide. Like, if you like, the Rajputs, female infanticide was also very common among Rajputs, but I won't go into that because it's maybe, outside the remit of today. But what I would continue to emphasize is all the facts about this are not on very firm foundations, really. And that's coming to modern times, the collection of media reports that you've made, how the media reports or how lawyers understand human sacrifice is it's just often bears very little relationship to what's really happening. Or when you say the people sacrificed a child in order to obtain a pot of gold. I mean, it's a lovely story, but it's probably usually so much more complex than that, including the psychology of it, obviously, because one of the other things I would emphasize is in the shift, when you have a community performing a human sacrifice, it's horrendous. You can say it's a kind of societal madness. But when you have an individual doing it, like in the cases Peter has just mentioned, I think very often there is an element of delusion, madness, that almost certainly is there. But then again, I mean, as I'm sure you face the question all the time, what is madness? If you look at, I'm going to take Saddam Hussein, not because he's like one of the worst people there's ever been, but if you look at, or say Hitler, or anybody who has been in a position of power and done horrendous things, is he mad? Is it a kind of, obviously he's very, very sane in some ways, and obviously crazy in certain delusions in other ways, which he is then projecting onto mass killings in society. So the medical definitions of madness is one thing, but what I'm talking about is a kind of cultural or societal form of madness, where there's like collective demands for somebody to be executed, as we've seen in some of the recent capital punishments in India. So coming back to the ritual as the evidence is, to me, persuasive that it did happen more or less like this. So the Khonds are a tribal people living in mostly tribal villages, but they're mixed with Dalits, called either Doms or Pano. And these people, apart from the like functions that they perform certain ritual functions, but more than that, they kind of intercede for the tribal people with the outside world. So the traders, if you go to the Doniyamgiri, like which many of you will have heard of, a lot of the Doms there have, through this trading, become richer and more numerous than the Dongria. So large sections of the Dongria villages are now Dom hamlets, or the streets are next to each other. So, but one of the ritual functions of these people in the times when the British came was that they captured victims for sacrifice and sold them to the Khons. And this is quite, again, a very, very hard thing to understand, but ritually, the sacrificial victims were called the Dom's child. So if a Dom couldn't provide a victim, he would have to give his own child. That was the idea. When the British came to the villages, they started collecting the victims to save them. And the victims were known as Mariahs. The word may be Mrivi in the Khon language, but generally it's known as Mariah, M-E-R-I-A-H. And in some villages there were quite a few of them. And these were people, they had been bought from the Doms, but they lived in the villages pretty much on an equal basis, but there was also an implication they were almost like serfs. And they were known to be potential victims, but they were not sacrificed until some shaman or somebody said that they should be. So very often they had children of their own, and then those children might end up as sacrifices. And when somebody was sacrificed, the whole village afterwards grieved for the death of this person. So, you know, they considered it like a sin. And in the words that are often repeated that they said at the sacrifice, they're saying, we are sacrificing you to the Mother Goddess. The sin is not ours. It's the goddess has called for it, or the Dom has sold it, or, I mean, you know, in that sense they were kind of almost denying what they did. And then the victim usually is drunk or like out of the senses. They do that as a kind of mercy or whatever, and before the sacrifice, because what happened is also known through when the British suppressed it, it was replaced, the human victim was replaced by a buffalo. So I've once or twice witnessed this buffalo sacrifice, and it's a very bloody event because basically the buffalo is allowed to charge around and hack to death with axes. So, and people are often drunk at the time because drinking is part of the tribal culture. And as I said, quite often somebody gets cut in all this. If you imagine lots of men with axes hacking a huge animal to death, then quite often a man gets hurt too. So it's almost like that has to happen. Some human blood has to fall on that day. So there's lots more about this. Like one of the things, when the British are there, like questioning through interpreters, why do you do this horrendous custom? And there's like one of the answers they were given was in order to make the turmeric a good deep yellow colour. You know, and that's the kind of thing that can become distorted. But what they're really saying is, for the fertility of the land, that Mother Earth gives us life, she also demands life. And for us all to stay healthy, somebody has to die. And turmeric is one of the main export crops of the Kond Hills, so the quality there of, you know, the best Indian turmeric comes from there. So, and it's obviously Haldi, you know, it's a very important symbol in lots of ways anyway. So there are, I mean, loads and loads of symbolism in understanding the whole of human sacrifice itself. But when I was doing the research on it, really what struck me was I spent much more focus on trying to understand the British actions than just to understand sacrifice. I mean, in some sense, I would say human sacrifice defies understanding, that we will all have our own different interpretations of it or understandings of it. But to understand what the British were doing, what they were doing there when they set up the Agency to Suppress Human Sacrifice was like an implicit part of the colonial endeavour. So in a way, what I did in that PhD thesis that became a book is a kind of reverse anthropology on my own culture to understand these British colonials who, with seemingly very good intentions, they're trying to suppress. I mean, in other parts of India, at the same time, they were suppressing sati. And, you know, probably most of us would be glad that sati was made illegal. They illegalized other forms of human sacrifice or violence around the same time. But in the case of human sacrifice, one of the things is this is a tribal people, and they had never heard of the British before. But in the way that the British annexed parts of India, they were very good at legally justifying it, obviously. And so the Nizam of Hyderabad had been conquered and changed his allegiance from the French to the British. Then what was called the northern Sirkars of what was Hyderabad state came out of British rule. One of them was a little town in Orissa called Gumsur, which is now called Banjanagar. Has anybody heard of that? It's like in Ganjam district. It's quite a big town now, and it was the centre of a kingdom. And so the kingdom, from the 1760s to the 1830s, kept not being able to give enough tribute, because the tribute was fixed according to what had been paid to the Marathas, and it was obviously a lot of money. And so the British kept changing the kings around, switching brother to brother, father to son, interfering as they did in so many dynasties. And finally the Raja absconded, and he took refuge. It was mainly a tribal district with the Khons. So the red-coated sepoys under the British officers charge into the Khond hills to try and capture the Raja and get his treasure or tribute. And in the process, the Khons resist them, and the Khons feel invaded. The Raja is their ritual head in some sense, and that itself is very interesting, the relationship, because it's quite an egalitarian one. A Raja can't be a Raja without tribal people accepting him. So when the British are kind of charging in there, then the Khons stage a very good ambush, and 2 of the British officers are killed. And then you can imagine what happened. The British, they want full revenge, and they want to bring the area under proper law and control, and they start burning villages, and then an administrator, the first agent for the suppression of human sacrifice, is a Scotsman called Samuel Charters Macpherson, and he takes a huge interest in the ethnography of the Khons, and really quite exceptional for that time. If you look in histories of Indian ethnography, his work is quite interesting, and he was quite sensitive to how he understood the religion. But while he was taking that interest, he also made friends with particular clans, and then they had traditional enmity with other clans who refused to give up their human sacrifice, victims, the Mariahs. So he started a whole huge war in the 1840s where Chokra Bissoy was the kind of legendary leader who resisted, and he was never finally captured, but the British went everywhere, burnt lots of villages, so in the process it was actually a war of conquest. But if you look in the history books, it's referred to as a rebellion. But in some sense, a rebellion, it's not a rebellion, because the Khons are resisting the first invasion. And the same happened actually with all the Indian tribal areas and with all the other areas in the world that have tribal peoples. And so how human sacrifice, it can be just that, as with, say, the Paharia in Bihar or other tribes, that these people are warlike and they need to be pacified. But the extreme cases involve human sacrifice because it gives the perfect justification for going in and conquering people. So when the British, in their kind of legal way, they find these cases of human sacrifice, then the first thing they do is take the victims away. They don't actually usually punish the people who sacrificed or were going to sacrifice, but maybe they imprison them or jail them or sentence them to hard labour or something, but then they do start to perform executions. So capital punishment, they're using that, and they actually talk about using capital punishment as having a salutary effect on bringing the people to law and order. And if you look at how the people they executed were mostly people who had taken up arms against them. They may have been human sacrifices. I didn't find direct evidence for that. But what's very interesting is, in a way, in this whole discussion, you've got human sacrifice and you've got capital punishment, and they're like two different ends of the same spectrum. And one of the differences is, in a way, capital punishment is the ultimate monopoly of the state on taking human life. That if I take human life in a murder, or by doing human sacrifice, or manslaughter in an accident, the state will punish me for it. But nobody punishes the state, obviously, for the capital punishments they do. And if you look at how the British did it, what I've said about the con sacrifices, it was like people were drunk, the victim was hacked to pieces, the victim was innocent, often a child. In the British case, the person had been judged guilty, far from being drunk. I mean, the order, there's sepoys standing there all around the gallows. The person is hung. It's an act of extreme kind of discipline and order, in a sense. I mean, there's often a crowd of cons watching it, but it is a ritual to instill fear in them, to show that the order of things has changed. Now you're subject to something called the British government or the Indian government, and you better behave and do what we tell you to, really. So that's one aspect of it. Then another is, a lot of the British people obviously were Christian, and for Christians there's a whole other level of what is human sacrifice. That Jesus' death on the cross for Christians was the ultimate self-sacrifice. For the Romans who executed Jesus, it was a capital punishment. So you've got this tension between the two things, the state-controlled power and self-sacrifice or sacrifice of another. Because if you look at more and more in understanding modern violence, and for example, Chhattisgarh, Orissa, what's going on there, I feel very, very involved in the violence there, or trying to understand it. And if you look at the Maoist conflict, every death of a Jawan there, who is a CRPF Jawan, is seen by the state as the sacrifice of a martyr. And every death of a Maoist is seen by the Maoist as a sacrifice of a martyr. And so both sides are using the concept of self-sacrifice. And then every war, if you understand it, in a way, if you look at some of the worst modern wars, like going on now in, say, Iraq and Afghanistan, the two biggest wars waged by America in the last few years, the number of people killed in those wars are horrendous, but they are not conceived of in terms of sacrifice or human sacrifice. So if you hear, like, Tony Blair, the British Prime Minister, when he was justifying it, like, maybe a million Iraqis died, but the war was necessary because Saddam Hussein was an evil tyrant and had to be removed, or something like that. And then what's very interesting too in relation to this question of human sacrifice is, when Saddam Hussein was discovered, and a sort of trial happened, although it was very unconstitutional, and then he was quickly executed. And his sons, I remember one of them in particular, when he was found, his head was cut off, and that head was shown in the mainstream media. I mean, it's almost like in modern times, you've rarely had such a kind of return to this kind of, say, medieval, that's like medieval wars where the enemy's head would be put on the castle walls or something. So understanding how well, in this case, how human sacrifice has been used consistently as an excuse or a justification for conquering another people or killing by the state. I think that's very important. I think I'm going to take a moment now to look a little bit at the origins of human sacrifice, because the origins really, it's like a custom that stands at the threshold of what we call civilization, and that's a huge paradox of it, that if you look at some of the ancient states and societies, and for example ancient Egyptian, ancient Sumerian, some of the Latin American ones like the Incas or the Mayas or Aztecs, human sacrifice was almost certainly a state ritual there. So with ancient Egypt, for example, I mean, which had, you know, it was very, very civilized and wonderful in some ways, but on the temple walls you see the pharaoh in a big size clubbing to death a prisoner or a huge number of chained prisoners. So when the Egyptians fought other peoples, it could be black Africans to the south, or it could be other enemies in Syria or somewhere, then captives were taken and they were then executed. So that, but in an idiom of human sacrifice in some sense. With the Incas, for example, they did an unusual form of human sacrifice. They had young men and women of quite noble families. The Incas were very much into social engineering, so they conquered other peoples, and then the elites of those were like brought into the mainstream, but some of the children were then reserved for human sacrifice of a very particular kind, that they were left at the top of mountains in special built structures to starve to death and to appease the mountain spirits or something. And like one of these cases, only in quite recent times was this mountain scaled by modern climbers, and they found the Incas had been there before and they'd constructed one of these huts with human sacrifice in it. So, but then, as in India, when you come to modern times, the idiom changes. So a book about human sacrifice in Peru really opened my mind to this and to the parallels with what's happening in India, that you had people who were equivalent to some of these priests who specialised in human sacrifice, and they were performing human sacrifice of poor people they've captured, mostly on behalf of the local mafia. So, in a way, what I'm saying is the way human sacrifice has changed in recent times is mostly, it's kind of accommodated to capitalism. That, if you like, mafia is by definition the kind of black economy, and very often actually the white economy is controlled by the black economy. So, you know, mafia heads are very, very big people. So when we come to what's happening in, say, Orissa and the tribal states now, you mentioned Jonathan Parry, and Jonathan Parry is quite an old friend and colleague at the LSE, an anthropologist who's studied the Pillay steel plant in Chhattisgarh. And as he mentioned, he also, like me, has been interested in cases of human sacrifice performed for an industrial project. So when you are opening a mine or a dam or building a big bridge, there's either human sacrifice or there are very strong rumours of human sacrifice. And as with witchcraft, as with many of these kind of, quote, exotic crimes, the reality is very hard to get to. But one very close Odia friend, who's an anthropologist, has said, like his teacher said, no major industrial project starts in Orissa without human sacrifice. And I can actually believe that. And what's relevant of that to what we're discussing is that the people who are captured, who perform human sacrifices, who are then condemned to death, are usually from the poor sections of society. The big industrialists may be indulging in it much more, but they will make sure they're not caught and let alone sentenced to death. I mean, one of the chief ministers of Orissa has been, at least in the media, allegations that he had human sacrifices performed. So, and you know, this kind of, it's not just among the poorer section of society that these kind of left-handed tantric ideas of the benefits of human sacrifice is there. Certainly goes back to the Vedas, as my teacher Veena Das emphasized. And to cut a long story short about the con human sacrifice, actually the Hindu Rajas around there were also practicing human sacrifice, and they also sent their soldiers to fire a salute at the con human sacrifice. So in this sense, the community aspect has been transformed into like almost a capitalist enterprise. And for people who are looking for a pot of gold or buried treasure, or who want psychic power, or they want a son and they're not able to get one or something, in a way that's the kind of individual self-interest that capitalism has promoted. It's, well, if you're looking at the Khond custom, it's the whole community. And although the Khond practice was suppressed by the British by the 1850s, it has almost certainly continued at times. And I met a police officer who was stationed in Lakshmipur in Korapat district in Orissa, and he said, when I was first posted there, I had to investigate a case of human sacrifice where all the village admitted to doing it. So I took all the men in the village to jail, but then in some sense the case fell apart because they couldn't get evidence of the kind needed or something. And the same Oriya friend, who's an anthropologist, who said this about the industrial anthropology, about human sacrifice for industrial projects, he also said when he was doing fieldwork among the Kutia Khons, and he kept asking questions about, what do you remember about human sacrifice? Do you ever still do it? And things like that. You can imagine how annoying anthropologists are. At one point, the people said, actually, we're about to do one. Do you want to come and see it? So he actually says, I mean, even I find it hard to believe my friend, but he said he was hidden up a tree and he witnessed the human sacrifice, which was a whole community or set of villages. And it was a boy aged maybe about 12 or something of the Gauro, the cowherd community, who had been captured or traded or something or bought, and he was sacrificed. And so why I'm saying this, this isn't an easy thing to talk about, but why I'm saying it is because in this case, even although it's secret now, obviously by definition, if they're doing this sacrifice, they can't do it openly, but they're doing it as a community. And while in the other cases we're talking about mostly it's more an individual thing. Coming back to the industrial, the human sacrifice for industry, for example, when the Vedanta aluminum refinery was built, rumours were, when I was living in the area, I mean, rumours believed by everybody around that certain children had been sacrificed, or that the kind of gundas of the company were out looking for children, or so, the reality of that or not, I don't know. And discussing this with Johnny Perry, we disagreed on that. He thought these are probably basically just rumours, and I thought there is probably really some factual stuff behind it. That, in other words, what I'm saying, and I mean I can go into that more, the evidence as I see it and having lived there and everything, but what I'm saying basically is that the rich get away, as in rape cases, as I'm sure you all know, like when the rapist is kind of working class, they can be condemned to death. When the rapist is a policeman or a soldier, you're not usually going to get the death penalty, even if they are humiliated, and which happens very rarely, actually. And so if you look, I mean, more and more since taking up this subject of human sacrifice, I've begun to reverse the lens more and looked at, for example, if you take the subject of rape, very often, especially looking at it in America, after the Vietnam War, the number of rapes in America surged because people were coming back from Vietnam, where they had raped and killed on a vast scale with huge impunity. And in other words, rape has been almost like a weapon of war, or quite normal in warfare, in many, many wars, right from ancient times to now. And yet, you know, we tend to focus on, I mean, the war crime rapes that are brought to trial in India maybe are quite rare in relation to the rapes of, as I say, normal working class people who've done it. And this is interesting because, again, I cannot say this is an absolute fact, but it is said that Shivaji, when he was on his military campaigns, if any of his men, even officers who were friends of his, committed rape, he would have them executed. He was said to have zero tolerance for rape committed by his own army. And I mean, imagine now if that was the situation in India, where CRPF Jawans, how many rapes have been committed in Chhattisgarh, in Manipur, so that's why looking at some of violent crimes of other kinds in relation to human sacrifice and capital punishment is very important. How much longer do I have? About 10 minutes, or anybody got
10 minutes.
Okay, thanks. If you're looking at the origins of human sacrifice, and really when I've started to do this systematically, there are two other particular customs that I would link it with. One is slavery, because if you look at ancient Greece, Rome, Egypt, the so-called ancient world, and India maybe too, but I'm not sure. In warfare, when people were conquered, very often the whole male population of a city or something would be killed. The youthful ones would be sold into slavery. The women would all be enslaved. And so you had this either killing or slavery. And then, as I said, human sacrifice, the Greeks and the Romans, they talk about it, but they talk about it as a dark ancient custom, not something they as civilized people do. But, as I say, they practiced violence on a much, much, much larger scale. And especially if you look at the Romans, and this is interesting because so much of modern law comes from Roman law. So they established very strong legal procedures and, I mean, you name it. But at the same time, they had some horrendous customs, and one was crucifixion. So people who had really gone against the state, like when Spartacus had led the slave revolt. I mean, the crucified slaves' crosses stretched for hundreds of miles in Italy. Jesus was only one of tens of thousands of people crucified to death. And another form of death was the gladiator games. And if you can imagine a society where many of the war captives, then they're trained as gladiators because they're good fighters, and then people pay money or are invited as an act of largesse by the ruling person to come and witness people fighting each other to death. And it's said the gladiator games is said to come from an Etruscan custom where it was a human sacrifice. It was like a ritual human sacrifice, where a fight to the death over the grave of some big person. And in a way that still survived when, if you have ever seen films or something like the gladiator swears to the emperor, I lay my life down before you or something. So it's all done in the ritual of self-sacrifice. And then the other form they had was when they conquered a people, like the Germans or the Gauls or the British, especially when I remember Julius Caesar conquered a great leader from Gaul called Vercingetorix, and he and his men were led into Rome, and the Romans would have a triumph, what they call a triumph, which is a triumph of possession of all the treasure and all the captives. And then at the end of that triumph, then they're shoved into a darkened room and killed. So in that sense, again, it's avoiding the honour of a kind of actual human sacrifice, but it is the state's power over, and as I started with the British case, like the British are insisting they're the only ones who have the right to take life. No Raja is allowed to, certainly no tribal people are allowed to. Another custom that's similar often is headhunting, that if you look at the Nagas, for example, their headhunting is a very violent custom, needs a lot of understanding. Thank you. And in ancient times, it has a lot of kind of parallels with this. One of the other things, this is so much embedded in what we take for granted that one of the most popular children's books, Robinson Crusoe, is based on this story. And I go into this in the book, and it's, if you remember the story of Robinson Crusoe, he's shipwrecked on an island. Then at a certain point, he realizes human sacrifices are going on the other end of the island with people who are coming on and bringing a victim and sacrificing them. So then he charges up to them. He rescues a victim who becomes his man Friday. And then he builds up a bigger thing, and then he kills all the people and rescues quite a few human sacrifice victims and builds a new society. So it's like such a blueprint of colonialism. And for example, when the Portuguese conquered Brazil, all along coastal Brazil, there was a tribe called the Tupinamba who were very, quote, civilized. They had almost cities. They traded with the Portuguese, but they were said to practice human sacrifice. So on the basis of that, the Portuguese did genocide of them. So anything else vital to, I think anything else you can bring up, like in question times, but maybe the way I looked at it in the book I wrote, the argument was human sacrifice of this kind was a horrendous thing. And I mean, even animal sacrifice, well, understanding blood sacrifice of animals there's a continuum in understanding that. But what the British did, in setting up a police force, a forest department, and everything over the tribals, taking the forest away from the tribals, it was what I called a sacrifice of human being. It was something going even far worse than human sacrifice. So, modern wars, Obama with his kill list, the Tuesday kill list, where he gives the names, he approves the names that the CIA have told him of people who can be killed in Yemen, Afghanistan, Pakistan, by drone attacks or by special forces across international boundaries. I mean, I don't believe in capital punishment, but I think some of the leaders who have caused these wars, including Tony Blair, Reagan, the Bushes, even Obama, I mean, they deserve the death penalty more than a lot of the, poor, probably deluded people who we're talking about. So, gentlemen, ladies, I rest my case. So, thank you.
I'd like to invite Dr. Sanjeev Jain to take us through the psychology of ritual murder.
We're not having a coffee break.
The culturally motivated sacrifice. We can serve tea and coffee inside if that's okay.
Alright, so we can do it. Take it and bring it inside.
Yeah.
Okay, if you guys can just go out and take the tea and bring it inside, then we can we'll be on time.
So, I'm Sanjeev, as Peter has already introduced, and what I'll be trying to do in the next 40 minutes or so is to give a kind of clinical psychiatric perspective, but deviating a bit into the history and the ideas about demonology, etc., that may be relevant to what we are talking about to this morning. Now, Psychiatry is a very young branch of medicine. We celebrated technically 200 years of psychiatry in somewhere in 2013. The word psychiatry itself was created sometime in 1813 or so. So it's got a long past, but a very short history of just 200 years. And madness, as we all know, has been recognized since antiquity, ever since human beings developed a sense of a subjective consciousness. So every known civilization has an account of knowing people who've gone mad. And since most of these cultures had an idea that the mind or the soul or the atma or the ruh, whichever way you call it, was attributable to divinity itself, any disorder of it was obviously caused by the opposite of divinity, which in most cases was some version of the devil or whatever. Equally well, however, the effects of drugs, fever, seasons, etc. were also known. So people knew you could go mad out of drinking too much wine, of consuming certain kinds of drugs. So this was also equally well known. And this changed very little till the Middle Ages. So from the beginnings of known history till about the middle of the last millennium, it was like that. And if you look at it, the three major traditions that we talk about in India, the Hindu, the Buddhist, and the Islamic medicine, all shared similar ideas, absolutely identical ideas approximately. The Ayurvedic system relied a lot on demonology. One should examine the patient for supernatural possessions. All signs of madness are further exaggerated. And these were to be treated by ritual offerings at certain places like charahas and by places where rivers met, and or smeared with ointments made of the skin of jackals, owls, bulls, goats, etc. So the fact that these kinds of animal products or these kinds of proscribed products to be used to treat madness itself gives you an indication as to how madness was literally the work of the devil. Buddhism had one of the 5 causes of insanity. After all these, that is karma, grief, work, the poisons and humors had been eliminated, was the work of demons. And demons could have all these properties. They cause acute and severe illness, and the disease is caused by a demon of artificial labeling, which is much like modern psychiatry. And treatment was often occult, like herbs, religious, blood taken from the knife that has tasted the blood of human beings, and things like that. And Islamic medicine was the most elaborate because it synthesized the Buddhist and the Hindu traditions. It recognized the existence of something called the ruh and the existence of something called the akal. So the cognitive consciousness was separate from the soul consciousness, which was a very big advance in psychiatry, and had a long history of psychotherapy. And the notion of the akal and the soul was distinct, but also simultaneously recognized the existence of jinns and the farishtas, who were symbolic in nature and which could be transformed into symbolic objects. So the jinns could act through material processes. However, the fact whether these were literally losses of abstraction in technical terms, that was an abstract attitude being converted into physical symbolism, is something that has been debated. As a Lama pointed out in the 19th century, the demons that the Lama Rinpoche pointed out in the 19th century were the demons of lust, laziness, attachment to wealth, hypersensitivity, bad companions, etc. So the demons, the literal demons of the earlier past, had been moved to this. And it's often been debated whether demons in psychiatry are the 7 deadly sins, the id impulses, the unknown forces, or merely neurochemicals. So the idea that there are some unknown forces, whether you think of them in terms of chemical changes or in terms of demons, has remained throughout psychiatry. To be specific, this is the famous book by Sprenger Malleus Maleficarum, which was used to identify witches. Now this is technically the first textbook of psychiatry, because it organized the symptoms of devils, of how devils took up human beings and how they took up residence in human beings. And this was the first compendium of abnormal behavior, of physiognomy of the devils. And since the mad people were the devils and the devils resided in the madmen, this technically became the first codification of how to detect the signs of madness, although it was technically how to detect signs of being possessed by the devil. And this was a popular book by the middle of the last millennium, by 1500. But what happened in the mid-1500s and the second part of the last millennium was the secularization of the body. People like Vesalius and Harvey discovered that the body was simply a physiological process. You could dissect it, you could understand how the heart worked, you could understand how the joints moved. And there was nothing mysterious or divine about it. It was amenable to human reason, to human logic, and you could dissect a body and understand the working of its components. And gradually this idea crept to the idea of dissecting the soul. So if a body could be dissected into its components, so could the mind. And this secularization of the mind created the field of psychology and psychiatry. So unless the secularization, or the distinction of the soul from any divine influence occurred, psychiatry and psychology could not technically arise. And this was a very important process in the so-called contemporary thinking. And that was started by a person called Johann Wehr on the deception of demons in 1583 as a answer to the books of Malleus Maleficarum. But however, this took its time, and a number of witch trials in the 17th and 18th century, and by the end of the 19th century, you had a completely different perspective, by which time the age of reason is supposed to have occurred. As you all know, the French Revolution occurred on the ground of reasonableness and rationality. At the same time, Anton Mesmer, the origin of the word mesmerism, had also become active. So at one hand, you could have mental faculties investigated as much like organs. So you could have parts of the brain which are involved in intellect and music, etc., etc. The phrenology perspective came up. And you had people like Philip Pinel and Theodor Reil, Johann Reil, who did this reform in the French asylums and legal systems. They insisted that the mentally ill be treated with humanness, with kindness, and Reil insisted that the disorders of the mind were manifestations of disorders of the mind itself, just like diseases were manifestations of diseases of the body. So the idea that there was a medical gaze important to classify the disease of the mind became exemplified by Reil. And these two psychiatric reformers, one in France and one in Germany, essentially laid the framework for the theoretical foundations of contemporary psychiatry. And this, as a branch of medicine, and this, Reil felt, has to be distinct from theology and the penal system, both of which he felt did not pay attention to the diseases of the mind. The theology obviously was rooted in divine origins of madness, which he felt was completely inaccurate. And the penal system simply recognized the consequences of the behavior and did not pay attention to the motivations of the person, and therefore was also inadequate to understand this behavior. Now, all this occurred sometime between 1750 and 1850, and this coincided with the introduction of British laws and healthcare into India. So it was not, to my mind, as much a colonial enterprise for purpose of power. It was simply a diffusion of ideas and the diffusion of the way deviance and irrationality were being looked at in Europe, and these ideas were now being applied all over the world with varying degree of success or clumsiness, as the case may be. It was very selective, of course, as you all know from you're all studying law, so you all know that the British law as applied to India tried to incorporate older evidences of Hindu law, the Islamic law, to some extent the Roman and the Greek laws, and these are all conflated into some kind of confusing system that we have now. But many common laws of British society were not included for putting into India. But, however, the entire edifice came to be seen as colonial laws, and the entire system of healthcare seemed to be seen as colonial medicine, which had to be resisted intellectually at every point. So there was a lot of resistance to the setting up of medical colleges, to setting up of hospitals by the elites of those times, which were the kings and the priests. Unfortunately or unfortunately, the vast people of India did not protest at all. So if you see a hospitals like, for example, in Bangalore, a small hospital had a clientele of 50,000 people a year out of a total population of 1.5 lakh. So half the people of India went to the British hospitals at that point of time because they recognized that the hospitals were a secular space where caste, creed, religion did not matter. And this openness of modern medicine or cosmopolitan medicine erased all previous identities of caste and religion. And therefore this became very successful, and hospitals became very important in the Indian firmament. Within French psychiatry over the 19th century, what one saw was the beginnings of moral treatment, that people could improve by a series of moral interventions, improved buildings, kindness, music, better facilities, etc., etc. But some people did not improve. And this automatically gave the idea of moral degeneracy. Now, moral degeneracy was, if the ages of rationality and reason, or the force of reason was so powerful, then there should be no unreasonable people in society. But the fact remained that they did exist. And for that, this debate is exemplified by what happened to Anton Mesmer, who believed in mesmerism, who believed in hypnotism, or originated the ideas that led to hypnotism. But he was investigated by a scientific commission during the late 1790s by Benjamin Franklin, Antoine Lavoisier, Bailey, and Guillotin, and he was expelled from the French Academy of Science for believing in the irrational transmission of souls from across people, unless there was a real evidence of communicating ideas. As mesmerism, I presume everybody has heard of. Yeah. So mesmerism is basically that my mind can influence the mind of another without physically interacting or in any way. And this was seen to be an irrational belief and incompatible with the attitudes of the French Academy of Sciences. And Antoine Mesmer was expelled from the Academy of Sciences for being irrational, mainly because the psychological state of one person cannot and should not be able to influence that of another. However, the mesmerism prospered, and the decline of faith, of theology, and the structures of political power created the space for subaltern voices to emerge of animal magnetism, hypnotism, seances, homeopathy, theosophy, epidemic hysterias. So just like religion and politics, the divine rights of kings and the church and this religion had suppressed certain kinds of psychological symptoms. In the absence of these symptoms tended to re-emerge. And the French then developed laws to regulate this moral degeneracy. The habitual criminals, the sex workers, and the addicts, and the other marginalized. And all of you would be familiar with the work of Foucault, and the way the marginalized were then incarcerated, and the punishment and the clinic became the major forces of towards this kind of normalization. And more importantly, normal behavior was formulated by the Victorian era, and that was the height of the British Empire in India. And this is also the era of the expansion of the psychiatric gaze. So the mad, the bad, and the sad. Now, instead of having divine influences, ended up having social influences. You could be mad because society treated you in some way. You had turned bad because society did things to you, and you could be, mad, bad, and sad for the same kind of reasons. There were no divine reasons. There were no other reasons. It was the social construct around you which produced this. Now, this point had been achieved over 200 years after the witch trials of Europe and America had been analyzed and discussed thoroughly. Now, I won't go into the witch trials of these situations, but it was those two exemplified as to how the mentally ill could be systematically persecuted, how positions of power and gender inequality could give rise to certain kinds of symptoms, how certain kinds of behaviors could be labeled as being dangerous and be classified as being equivalent to witchcraft. I'll give you a small specimens from, let's say, history. This is a vignette from the asylum of Delhi, where a Sikh soldier is admitted in 1883 and is caught eating the dead body of a child, which is as, grotty a task as you can think of. The soldier explains that he belonged to a particular sect of Sirbhangis that forbade them to work or to beg for food. But they were basically guerrilla soldiers of Ranjit Singh's army, and you had to be undetectable. And if you don't work, and you don't beg, you're undetectable. So the idea was that you eat whatever the animals ate, and you could survive as a terrorist behind enemy lines. And they were supposed to eat whatever Providence brought their way. Walking along the riverside, he saw jackals eating the body of a child, and he did the same. What is interesting is that the psychiatrist, through all the difficulties of interpretation, says that this person is not insane, and he discharges him within 4 weeks. Now, this kind of acceptance of local tradition is quite remarkable, that he does not give a value judgment, he does not call him weird, he doesn't call him odd, he just says he's not insane, and he discharges him. On the other hand, you had all these wolf children, which are still commonly reported in the media, that these children have been brought up by wolves. There was some report from Meerut a few years ago. And Sleeman, who the notorious or the famous governor of Awadh, who tried to intercede on behalf of Wazir Ali Khan, etc., ordered an inquiry into this and said that most of these are people with mental handicap who've been abandoned by their family because they cannot afford to look after the mentally ill or the mentally handicapped. And they end up living in the jungles and becoming animal-like. And one of the reporters who reported on this was Kipling, and which is actually the beginning of Mowgli and all that, who is now obviously well known. It still happens in Karnataka. Children and mentally ill people are dumped in the forests of Bandipur and Nagarhole. Now, when we go through the histories of these, for example, we can go over these several cases of violent crime mentally recorded throughout the 19th and 20th century in the archives available in hospitals in India. There are capricious murders of 1872, a mother on way to commit suicide, most probably with a postpartum disorder, with a child is saved, but the child has been killed by then a father who killed his son for asking for another banana. So it tells you the degree of deprivation. There are demonic attacks in 1880, infidelity, which is a very elaborate case note, elaborate delusion involving conversion and assault by other group listed as grief. So this person is in love with somebody from the other religion, converts to another religion to marry the girl, is then hacked, is then beaten up because he has converted, and that is sign of madness, and then he's brought back. But the doctor records this as love-struck grief, not as anything else. In Nagpur, there are a number of patients who are admitted. A gaunt cultivator murders a child and attributes it to the wrath of God Barha Deo for neglect of worship. Another gaunt who murders his wife was acquitted on grounds of insanity, but is ordered to be in an asylum. In the Ranchi, which is the center of Jharkhand, what is now Jharkhand and Chhattisgarh, or the largest mental hospital in Bengal. By 1937, there were 400 patients who were implicated in murder and 3 for rape. Now, the fact that there are 400 criminally insane who have been thought to have murdered people is quite astonishing. There's not a single one in any mental hospital right now, or very few, let's say less than 20 or 30. So what has happened now is that the criminally insane have been put back into the jails rather than in the hospitals in contemporary India. For the last few years, we have no data at all. Now, what is the usual diagnosis that we see in the clinic with all these? And this will be a kind of deviation into hardcore clinical psychiatry. A delusion is defined as a conviction which is false and irrational and out of the cultural context, includes romantic and erotic delusions as well as those of persecution and grandeur. Neurotic delusions were first defined in the early 20th century as something like what was called a Clermont syndrome, in which people, usually it was young women who developed a delusion that somebody very powerful, the French Prime Minister or whatever, was in love with them and kept on pestering them with accusations of having neglected them. That was only the first case report, which was very famous, but a large number of cases that we get now of stalking or of this kinds of things are actually erotic delusions of love, which is actually false. Persecutory delusions are also quite common, and so are grandiose delusions. An obsessional impulse, however, is something else where patients have violent impulses to do something, like jump in front of a train or cut themselves or cut somebody else. But at the point of having this, they know that this is a wrong idea, that they know that they should not be having this idea at all, and they're trying to resist it, but for forces beyond their control, they are unable to resist this. Morbid impulses, on the other hand, often do not know that the thoughts or the consequences are wrong in themselves and have no idea that this is wrong in itself. We have patients with other kinds of psychopathology, hallucinations, voices telling you all the time to kill, and these kinds of things do happen. You have doppelgangers, in which patients believe that they have been duplicated and there's another persona of theirs which is doing all this, or that there's a kind of duplicate self of their own which is going around. An Othello syndrome, which is often seen with patients with alcoholism, then start believing that their spouses are unfaithful, typically they're usually men, and then go to all kinds of elaborate efforts to write this, and of course there are drug-induced states. What is of concern to us in the context of witchcraft is this whole context of shared delusions, or folie à deux. Now, folie à deux was defined first in the mid-19th century in France over a series of case reports, and the ideas spread as ideas do. And this is a case report from 1906, which is interesting in itself. An Indian couple, what they call a colonial couple, is probably Indian. The concept of India doesn't exist, so it makes little difference. They had both become mad, as the doctor pointed out at Charing Cross Hospital, because of preoccupation with spiritualistic and mystical nonsense. The woman wanted to spiritually improve herself, was insistent on meditation and doing all kinds of funny things to improve her spiritual and inner life, had been attending all kinds of spiritual nonsense again in Calcutta, and had wanted to somehow become a purer person. And they were preoccupied with psychic research, advised by the doctors to get rid of all these funny ideas and scrub floors and bear children. Because they thought that this kind of yearnings of both the husband and wife were a perversion of unsatisfied paternal instincts. They had spent several thousands of pounds, run from hotel to hotel in London, accusing each other of being mad, for being more mad about psychical improvement and spiritual improvement, and ultimately they were counseled by the British doctor and returned to the colonies. Now, this kind of preoccupation with the inner world was itself seen as a symptom of madness by the British, by this British doctor. But what does follow a do or a shared delusion typically manifest? It usually manifests an asymmetric power equation in a family unit, typically seen by mother-daughter, very rarely with the father as the leader. And the delusion, one person starts believing in a false belief and the other members start believing in that system. It sometimes leads to very, in a sense, humorous results. So there was a patient we had who insisted that he could see into the future, and he had whatever divine powers. The family earned quite a substantial amount by his astrological powers, and he had transferred the skill to the 3 children, who all had a successful practice of being astrologers and soothsayers into the future. The father died, and this capacity disappeared. But they continued to believe that the voices they were hearing, that's the first time people realized that the voices they were hearing and the reasons for being able to foretell the future were actually signs of schizophrenia. And that's when they were brought into treatment. As long as they were earning money with this, although it was clearly, the symptoms didn't change. They were all hearing voices, they all believed in all these funny things, but nobody ever thought that they were ill. There was another lady who we saw many years ago. She had actually built a small church which had to be demolished because it was obstructing the construction of progress, etc., etc. But this lady had converted into Pentecostal faith, believed in all these voices and direct communication. Her family believed in it. They earned a lot of money off it. She had a congregation of several thousands. But as things do happen, she became more and more ill, and they brought her into hospital, and the family had a very peculiar request: treat her, but make sure she doesn't stop hearing voices. Because that's what to them was a symptom of the possession of the direct communication with God. There are several kinds called imposi, simultaneous, communique, and intuitive, which are, you can check their French origin by the way they're spelled, so please excuse my pronunciation. Imposition is basically one person getting a delusion and imposing it on the others because of this asymmetry. Simultaneous is just the fact that many people in a family can actually develop mental illness at the same time. So very often siblings do develop the illness at the same point in their lives, in their 20s, and very often they're just 2 or 3 years apart. So people do happen to have mental illness at the same time. Communique is the most typical one, which is that this is somehow it is communicated to a large number of people. And in contemporary terms, there is also a word called multiform, and it involves multiple people. And intuit is when two people who are already mentally ill start sharing their delusions with each other. It's technically a contagion, and separation of the people actually leads to resolution in some cases. Now, this is the troublesome part, because if 200 years ago Mesmer could be expelled for understanding the transmission of ideas by this kind of communication is irrational. How does it still exist? How does it still occur? What do we mean by cultural contagion? What do we mean by personal imposition of viewpoints on another? Is it to do with so-called brainwashing? Is it actually to do with some kind of extreme degree of mind control? And what are the processes, and how do we call it as being irrational or a symptom of madness? You're calling one person mad, and the other person is technically rational, but he's been influenced by the madness, which leads you to question, can rationality be overcome by madness? Can there be a rational way to deal with madness? So these kinds of debates lie at the heart of this issue, as you would realize from the case notes that you heard earlier, when one person is thought to be evil, but the others are supposed to have been contaminated by the evil and not evil by themselves. So this kind of debate carries on in psychiatry too. Very often these are persecutory, so there are cases in which people say that they are being poisoned, and then everybody starts believing they are being poisoned, and we get this fairly commonly. The entire family moves houses because these neighbors are bad. They move to a new neighborhood, these neighbors are also bad. Then you move to another house, and these neighbors are also bad. So gradually the whole family starts believing in a sense of persecution, and often to tragic consequences that you can read in the papers all the time. Now, the issue with all this is that sometimes this can lead to very widespread effects of what the kind you saw in Jonestown Massacre, or the cult Kardashians and these cultish experiences, where the idea that these delusions can, or this belief in these kinds of experiences can be shared by otherwise so-called normal people becomes a dangerous precedent and gives rise to mass murder or mass sacrifice. At one level, these kinds of things also overlap with the typical syndromes, and this is something that we've been talking about in the study, that there are overlaps of so-called sociopathic behavior, or the irrecoverable dangerous people, which are quite worrisome to a psychiatrist. There's a whole syndrome that we now know of, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, which was previously known as hyperactivity and impulsivity, and now politely called externalizing symptoms to reduce all the stigma of the first three terms. But this is basically children who tend to be very impulsive, tend to try out new things, are rather impervious to discipline, want to break rules all the time, and a subsection of those, perhaps less than 10%, go on to have criminal behavior when they are adults. On the other hand, we have the autism spectrum, or Asperger's, people who have very poor social intelligence, unable to experience the emotions of others, and unable to empathize with others. So I'll give you some examples of both from our clinical work. So the first one is very easy because you see it all the time. When people who simply take to a life of crime because they find they do not understand the limits of rules. So they just take to a life of stabbing, of petty crimes, of calling people, and ultimately they have a Benic episode or some other episode and they come back to us. Autism, I had a young boy who was around, I had been seeing him since he was a child, and at the age of 18 or 20, the parents had left him alone with his younger sibling, and he had just killed the younger sibling just to see what it feels like. He was just sitting there with the dead sibling next to him. Not next to him, but he tried to drown them in the household well. So this kind of very poor emotional behavior which occurs, a lack of empathy towards others, and this also overlaps with social modeling, with developmental insults, both organic and psychological, and histories of trauma. Now this is again where the so-called psychological or neuropsychological evaluation of people who have been involved in violent or criminal behavior comes in, because for years we have been able to find out or investigate that no matter what you do, you can do a simple thing like an EEG or an MRI, and people who are in jails have higher rates of abnormality than people who are outside. Full stop. There's no direct link between one and the other. People in jails also have higher histories of childhood sexual abuse, they have higher histories of trauma, they have a higher history of social deprivation, and they also have higher evidence of brain damage. So which one of these is going to be used at what level of separating the causality of this act needs to be understood. It's not merely just the social context, it's also the impact that society and environment have had actually on their brains to reduce the level of insight, awareness, social competence, etc., etc. And of course, drug abuse makes a whole factor. There are obviously older anthropological issues, which I'm not going to go into detail, but amok was the typical thing of the Southeast, where people would suddenly become violent, allegedly possessed by the demon again, and were normal after that. And Koro, which is a sense of genital retraction, often caused in their mind by witchcraft or malevolent influences, and would often give rise to epidemic hysteria and ritual murders. Now, the possession syndromes are another category in which many of these acts occur because people say that they have been technically possessed by the goddess. Now, this act of possession by the goddess is something that needs to be understood in slightly more complex terms. In contemporary psychiatry, they are, at least since the time of Freud, they are seen as dissociative disorders of being hysterical in origin. Now, the word hysterical has been eliminated from contemporary psychiatry because of its obvious gender labeling issues. But what dissociative disorders basically defines is a loss of continuity of self. that the person believes that for the little while that he's no longer the same person. That all of us remember us as being roughly the same person since the time we were born, although we've learned how to speak English and use PowerPoint, but we're essentially the same person as we were born. But this sense of discontinuity can be quite troublesome. And this, if it is accompanied by an inclusion or adoption of another identity, becomes even more troublesome. And then, of course, it raises the question that if that identity does some acts, where is the locus of control of, or the willfulness of the act? Is it in personality number 1 or is it in the personality number 2? And therefore, to decide the psychological motivation of the act becomes very, very important. We do get cases like this sometimes, not very often, and typically I've never seen anybody who's done a violent crime in this so-called dissociative spell. But you do get patients who have been taken to these healing shrines where they have been possessed, and during the state of possession they have indulged in behavior which is very, very different. So for example, we had a young lady recently who happened to be Muslim, and she was taken to a dargah. The dargah happened to be slightly on the margins of Islam, so she was encouraged to smoke ganja and have some drinks. And the husband was quite amazed that this lady, who had never ever had a drink before, drank half a bottle of rum without any consequence and smoked several joints without any consequence. She behaved absolutely normally. So he was quite mystified, and that proved to him that a jinn really had taken over her body. Otherwise, how would she ever do such things which she's able to do, which she has never ever done in her life? So this kind of capacity that jinns or some kind of acts can influence the way you behave in your day-to-day life is pretty strong. Now, again, to fit into what Dr. Padel was saying, right next to NIMHANS there is a temple behind Christ College. All those you've been at Christ College, you know the temple right next door. And we actually had a patient some years ago who was very upset because she had not been able to do the sacrifice that she had promised at that temple. Now this is about 1 kilometer from NIMHANS, just behind Christ College. And sacrifices continue to this date. And people get upset about the fact that they've not been able to do sacrifices to this date. Of course, the cultural tropes by which people get possessed, who they get possessed by, if it is Kali, if it is Bhadra Kali, if it is all the numerous goddesses in southern India, or by the fact of a dead ancestor or somebody else, also has a cultural significance. But usually the acts of this possession or this dream is a very nuanced thing. Now this ties in with much older ideas about the nature of dream work in both Islamic medicine and Hindu medicine. The Islamic world, for example, never differentiated between the non-reality of the dream and the reality of the lived world. For example, Tipu Sultan could write enormous detail about how the dream signified his victory over the English or the Marathas in a particular war, or how symbols which he experienced in dreams were actually reflected in his political life. So they did not really differentiate in the sense, and this follows of almost 800 years right from the times of Ibn Sina, of how dreams are to be interpreted within the context of both Islam and to a large extent also of Hinduism. So the fact that dreams demand certain action or they are harbingers of certain things is also well known in Indian, at least in the Indian cultural experience. So these kinds of cultural tropes, the thing that people sacrifice people to get rid of bad dreams is not as unreasonable as it sounds, because there is a whole philosophical tradition or a cultural tradition of trying to react to dreams as if they are actually real phenomena. Of course, you do get cases of epileptic fugues and infections and tumors. So right now we've got a person who's probably had an infarct, has probably had an infection, has been wandering around with a different identity for 2 weeks. And so he's going back between neurology and psychiatry while I try to figure it out. But simple mundane causes like a viral infection also causes all this. Why is it that we need to evaluate all this psychiatrically? Because, as is obvious in the legal profession, the origin and the motivation of the act that has been committed is as important as the act itself. If the act is arising out of a lack of intellect or unsoundness of mind, then the reasonable state cannot and should not appear to punish the unreasonable for their lack of reason. And this is not a new idea. This is Pope law regarding insanity way back in the 19th century. Insofar as the insane or the mad are irrational, the insane, though in the state, are not of the state. Now, this is the beginning of the state as being a rational, reasonable institution. On the other hand, although not of the state, the insane are yet in the state, so their rights have to be protected. Hence, the state has relations with them, though not those which it has with the citizens proper. So, in a sense, it marginalizes the insane, it marginalizes those with intellectual defects or any unreason, because the state now is the sole arbiter of reason. And that is a very important aspect of the way we treat these kinds of irrational behaviors. They are possessed of a physical force without a regulating mind, subject to the natural instincts, uncontrolled by the fear of punishment. Just 5 minutes. Yeah. And class of insane threaten continual danger to those with whom they are brought into contact. So all these issues of the non-recoverability, the permanence of certain psychopathic behavior, and the very difficult relationship between the forces of reason as exemplified by the state and the impulses to unreason as exemplified by the individual. So the notion of hardened or non-reformable criminal behavior therefore still gets reflected in ideas of degeneracy, that we call them by all the names that Peter read out, that these are morbid, these are people who cannot be improved, they are really bad people, and also the ideas of Galton and Bertillon, who set out these kinds of anthropometric studies of criminal behavior in the 19th century. The fingerprints, the facial forms, the cranial sizes of the criminals, the way the criminals, the so-called identikit picture that you can produce of hardened criminals, of criminal tribes. So these are ideas of the 19th century, which were then applied by anthropologists to classify all the people of all the humankind into phases that matched the power and the degenerate structure of Western society itself. So primitive societies typically had cranial sizes and anthropometry which resembled those of the French or the European criminals, and therefore they could be justified as being the criminal tribes, as being primitive. So this kind of technocratic justification of all kinds of processes. So these, and of course, on the other end, we had people like Mahatma Gandhi, who in 1945 or something, 45 or 46, about a year before he was killed, actually suggested that prison officials should behave like mental hospital doctors. A very optimistic viewpoint, but basically that just like psychiatrists help patients get better, prison officials should become like mental hospital doctors. Unfortunately, it's becoming the other way around now, but that's neither here nor there. But all these ideas come back with issues like neurophysiology, the implication of the belief in lie detector tests. In fMRIs, the government wants to fund studies which can pick up using brain scans, criminal behaviors, etc., and of course with genetics. Now, in any case, if the act itself seems to arise of incongruent, incompatible frameworks of reason itself, now this is where the problem comes. If you have a way of life or an ideological subjective consciousness which actually assumes that sacrifice or murder is valid, just like with the Thuggy movement in the 19th century, or the banning of the sacrifice, or the banning of sati. Now, those of you who are interested I think it's all available now. The very detailed letters written to Bentinck by, I think, parts of the Tagore family protesting against the banning of sati, or the protestations written by Tagore's family on the raising of the age of child marriage, suggests that this interface between so-called irrational behavior or primitive behavior and the force of rationality are very, very different. Therefore, a psychological and psychiatric assessment becomes essential, because psychiatry itself has not been able to address this tension. Now, this is very, very troublesome. I don't know if many of you are aware of something called the DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual in Psychiatry, which is like the so-called codification of psychiatry for very obscure reasons. But the point is that because of the First Amendment in America, the freedom of religion and the freedom of thought, what would seem to be irrational belief cannot be called irrational in America. If you believe that you are a harbinger of God who will be taken away by a satellite on such and such day and from such and such a hill, and because you hear voices from Mars which tell you that you are the next Christ, you cannot be called mad. You cannot be called insane. Now, that would not be the case anywhere else in the world, except in America, because their insistence on the ultimate freedom of thought and freedom of no impediment on reason itself gives rise to this situation. And therefore, between the American system, at the same time, they will execute people because they say that they don't recognize unreason at all. So if you've done an act, you must have thought about it, and therefore the McNaughton rules, etc., do not apply because it's not valid anymore. Now, this is not a common debate. This is not a rare issue. Now, this is a book written in the 12th century about India. The peculiarities of human beings change in every period. In the present times, the temperament is changing every moment, but the physicians still regard the characteristics of the past as indicated and base their diagnosis on this with no benefit. Most of the public is nowadays suffering from superstitions of demonic possession, shadows of devils and fairies, but their treatment is to be different. Now, this is faced with the population of Delhi when this Rahat al-Insan was written in the 12th century. So beliefs in demons and fairies have troubled people forever. And as Anthony Storr, a prominent psychoanalytically derived psychiatrist, puts in perspective, one man's faith is another man's delusion. Just like, as you know, the one man's independence is another man's terrorism. So we find that whole communities will crazed upon a religious scruple, and neither of them recovering its senses until it has shed rivers of blood and sowed a harvest of groans and tears, and to be reaped by its posterity, as you can see happening even now in India. That religious scruples give rise to all kinds of madness, and this is in 1841. Why has this situation occurred? Because to a large extent, whichever way you want to use it, in a purely colonial perspective or post-colonial perspective, there is a kind of lack of renaissance in India. That India has not, in that sense, interfaced with modernity itself. The dialectic between religion and science, or faith and reason, has not or has never actually occurred in India, because the two have been seen to coexist quite comfortably. Because for whatever reason, you can have ships, you can have industrial factories being built with human sacrifice, you can have satellites which are launched into space with coconuts being broken. So science and medicine are not in conflict in the day-to-day life. So this essential difference in the two systems of logic or rationality and irrationality has not actually been called into question. Whatever we do have of science and society and instruments of governance, including the legal profession and the medical profession, has come in as a set of operating rules, not as a lived experience. But asymmetric power and knowledge has stultified this into a formalized application of both legal systems and the healthcare system without its dynamic process in society itself. So rather than limiting faith, we are now trying to limit reason itself. So it's the opposite that we are trying to do. We are trying to define the limits of reason rather than defining the limits of faith. Why is it important? Because this is a process by which we are progressively going, in a sense, backwards. By mid-19th century, native doctors understand what is hysteria, they use faith. But by the end of the 19th century, Indians are saturated with superstition, highly imaginative and credulous, especially under the influence of a sahib. So this is the way the superstitiousness of Indians is seen to get up. And the asymmetry of knowledge becomes even more prominent, that this kind of inability to understand what the civilized perspective is to the traditions of India makes Indians fall back onto this reaction of very assertive assertion that whatever happened before the British was somehow better than what it is now. So there's a kind of reversal to medieval or pre-medieval tropes of demons and superstitions, and there's a kind of acceptance in the intellectual space that these are actually valid ways of experience, which is quite troublesome. Of course, it is sometimes completely let's say, manipulative and cheating. So this is an example of phrenology on the left, which is corpus callosum and parts of the brain as discovered by Vesalius, and by dissection, very thorough dissection of the human body. And to the right is the 1,000-petal lotus chakra of the head, ostensibly based on tantric philosophy, but written in English in 1903. So based on this straightforward plagiarism, you put back your historical traditions of 1,000 years and invent that you have actually predated all this and you are the ancient harbingers of wisdom. So these kinds of manipulation of knowledge goes on all the time. And this doesn't end there. For example, this is a photograph I took a week ago on 1st September. Have mercy on me, O Lord, son of David, my daughter is severely possessed by a demon. This is on the friary, St. Anthony's Friary, which lies between St. John's Medical College and the Christ College. So the belief in demons exists on the billboards, even now, by the so-called progressive forces that are supposed to guide. The institute also runs a college of psychology and counseling psychology, and actually has a psychology faculty attached to it. Now, how will the demons sit with the demons of Freud and id, and with the demons of dopamine and serotonin a few 100 meters further? I have no idea. But at this point of time, it is really troublesome that nobody is willing to question the issues of demonology in India. We have not had an equivalent of the analysis of the Salem witch trials or the witchcraft trials of the 17th century in India. We have accepted them, we have tried to negotiate with them, but nobody has pointed out, like it happened in Europe and America, that these are not compatible with the modern sense of existence. I think the issue is more to draw a firm line against superstition, because matters of faith are still very contentious in India. But that has contaminated this whole debate, because I find it astonishing that for example, the specific case that is under discussion, that the plea of insanity or a plea of a shared delusion or the plea of some kind of psychological pathology was not even raised. Very pejorative words are used about the bad nature of their psychological state, or the fact that they're malicious people. But the stigma of mad is so bad that it is better to be malicious than to be mad, which is quite different in the rest of the world. Madness is seen as something which is understandable, as a more secular way of understanding what badness is about. But if you refuse to acknowledge the mad and say everybody is bad, that is a very dangerous precedent. Thank you for your attention.
I'd now like to invite Ms. Rebecca John to take us through the legal frameworks of capital punishment and its interface with the multiple issues that arise when capital punishment looks at ritual murder.
Earlier this year, I was part of the legal team that had argued the case of 148 workers of the Maruti Udyog factory at Manesar, where 148 workers were put on trial for the murder of one man. Even after 30 years of practice, sometimes you're surprised at the extent of fabrication that takes place and how easily courts succumb to that fabrication without even asking basic questions. As it turned out, we got 117 of them acquitted of all charges, honorably acquitted. In fact, the court gave a verdict that they were falsely implicated in the case. But 13 workers were sentenced to life imprisonment. I spent almost a week in Gurgaon arguing this case on behalf of these workers. And I was not supposed to go for the sentencing hearing because it was more or less agreed that the judge was going to give them life imprisonment. I suddenly received a very panic call from my colleagues in Gurgaon saying, you have to come because the state is asking for the death penalty for these 13 workers. So I rushed to Gurgaon only to be told that two judgments had been cited by the state. One was the judgment of Jagmohan, and the other was the judgment of Ravji versus state. Interesting, because the judgment of Jagmohan really has no place now with the amendment to the Code of Criminal Procedure, in particular 354(3), and it was pre-amendment. And the judgment of Ravji has been specifically overruled by the Supreme Court itself. So a state prosecutor, in a case which attracted a lot of national attention, is asking for the death penalty of 13 workers on the basis of two judgments which no longer form part of the legal landscape in India. This is the level of ignorance that we see amongst the legal fraternity. we talk of ignorance and illiteracy of people who are condemned to death, we very rarely talk of ignorance that exists in the legal fraternity, both among lawyers, I'm one of them, and amongst judges. And this affects their understanding of almost all cases, not necessarily cases relating to human sacrifice, but also other cases. So perhaps this is a good time to revisit the legal landscape with respect to death penalty. And I think we need to do that more and more and more, because the biggest offender is the Supreme Court itself, because it does not follow the law laid down by it by constitutional benches in earlier cases. So while revisiting this landscape, let me first talk about the Constitution Bench judgment of Bachchan Singh versus State of Punjab, where the Supreme Court said the death penalty must be imposed only in extreme cases, and in making that choice of sentence, in addition to the circumstances of the offense, due regard must be paid to the circumstances of the offender. It also warned that judges must never be bloodthirsty. Now, I find this really, really interesting, and I think if there is one takeaway comment from any judgment that any court has given in this country, it is this, that judges must never be bloodthirsty. These days, I find it hard to believe that they are not bloodthirsty, because everything they do reminds me that they are bloodthirsty. And Bachchan Singh further went on to say that a real and abiding concern for the dignity of human life postulates resistance to taking life through law's instrumentality, that option ought not to be done, save in the rarest of rare case, when the alternative option of life is unquestionably foreclosed. So we must remind ourselves that this really is the landscape within we should move. But despite Bachchan Singh's ruling, we went through a period of great judicial confusion, leading us to judgment after judgment, and finally to the judgment of Ravji versus State of Rajasthan, where the Bachchan Singh formula was virtually overruled, and a new formulation of crime not criminal became relevant for sentencing. And this went on for a substantial period of time. Now, in order to bring some order to the chaos that the Supreme Court itself was bringing in its judgments, we finally had a judgment, Santosh Kumar Satish Bhushan Bhariyar versus State of Maharashtra, where it was declared that the law laid down in Ravji was per incurium, and noted that in at least 6 subsequent decisions, death penalty was wrongly awarded because of Ravji's case. Now, the court focused on the requirement that the alternative punishment of life had to be unquestionably foreclosed. It drew upon Bachchan Singh to emphasize that the state has to lead evidence to show that the convict could not be rehabilitated or reformed. And I think we must underscore that, because when we talk of sentencing, it is very important for us to demand as practitioners of the law that the state must lead evidence to show that the convict cannot be rehabilitated or reformed. An interesting judgment in 2010, it was a case relating to Makoka, Muhammad Farooq's case, where the Supreme Court actually talked about the swinging fortunes of an accused person. And it said, and I quote, "Swinging fortunes of the accused on the issues of determination of guilt and sentence at the hand of the criminal justice system is perplexing. The inherent imperfections of the system is accentuated by lack of legal aid and access to courts, and inarticulate information on the socio-economic and criminological context of crimes. It is invariably the marginalized and destitute who suffer the extreme penalty of death." Now, I find it interesting that the Supreme Court made an acknowledgement that there were swinging fortunes of the accused on the issue of determination of guilt and sentence. Now, this in a nutshell, being the legal landscape. I mean, of course, the Supreme Court has talked about the fact that a sentencing court must look into the aggravating and mitigating circumstances of the crime, the aggravating and mitigating circumstances of the criminal, and only then move on to the RR test, which is the rarest of rare test, and then make a determination as to whether death penalty should be imposed in a given case or not. Now, this being the legal landscape in which the question of death penalty comes to be decided, how have courts fared while looking at cases involving human sacrifice? Now, the stories, traditionally, what is viewed by most courts is that human sacrifice is the act of killing another human being, usually as an offering to a deity, as part of a ritual. But as Peter read out from his concept paper, the stated motives of sacrifices have actually ranged from curing mental illnesses, ensuring better harvest, protecting villages from malevolent spirits, finding hidden treasures, etc., etc. The stories that have emerged are not of diabolical masterminds, as courts like to call them, but of socio-economically vulnerable people facing severe environmental stress. How do courts actually look at these people? Is there an understanding of the nature of crime? Are courts guilty of making several sweeping generalizations and assumptions that serve to dehumanize the perpetrators? Do our courts look at the socio-economic background of the accused? Do they follow up these cases with medical and psychiatric assessment, or do they simply decide that these people are incapable of reformation and therefore must be condemned to death? While examining the case law on the subject, I was pleasantly surprised to see that some of the earlier case law of this century was actually more compassionate than the case law that subsequently followed. And one of the earliest judgments I could lay my hands on was a judgment which came from Calcutta. It's called Karma Urang versus Emperor, in which a son is accused of killing his father. He thereafter picked up the head of his father, wrapped it in something, and was proceeding along the road to Silchar Court. And he was seen by some witnesses. Constables overtook the accused, who was walking in an ordinary fashion, and they persuaded him to come to the Thana and to tell a story. He thereafter went and made a confession before a magistrate in which he said that unless he killed his father, he was about to die. He was put under the observation of a civil surgeon by the court for a considerable period. And the civil surgeon said that the appellant had a definite delusion which passed off after a couple of months, and that he could not tell right from wrong, that he was definitely insane, and that he wanted to dedicate his father's head to goddess Kali. The civil surgeon said that from the story told to him, he got the impression that the accused thought that he was ordered by Kali to kill his father. Be that as it may, these factors were taken into account at the time of appreciating the evidence. And the court very interestingly says that it seems to me to be the best evidence in this case upon the question whether he knew that what he was doing was wrong or contrary to law. In view of that evidence, what is supported by other evidence in the case, particularly by the very strong evidence of the civil surgeon, who is not only more competent to give, but had far more opportunity than any one of us in forming a correct opinion, in my judgment, this appeal should be allowed. So not only did he not get sentenced, the appeal was allowed. And it was allowed because the court took into account the very extensive findings of the civil surgeon with respect to the mental health of this man. Now, this is a judgment of 1927. There is another judgment of 1947, I think, where again the court has taken into account the mental health of, yes, this is a judgment of 1948, again coming from Calcutta, Asharuddin Ahmad versus the King, where the accused was was implicated because of the murder of his 5-year-old son. He was sentenced to transportation for life. And in this case, the court was of the opinion that the accused was clearly, I mean, they allowed him to take the plea of unsoundness of mind under Section 84 of the Indian Penal Code, and came to the conclusion that the accused was clearly of unsound mind and had acted under the delusion of his dream. He made the sacrifice believing it to be right, and therefore they allowed the appeal and set aside the conviction under Section 302. Now, in post-independence India, particularly over the last 2 decades, the judgments have been more or less problematic, except for one judgment coming out of Andhra Pradesh and another coming out of the Delhi High Court. The Andhra Pradesh judgment, which is an interesting judgment, of course convicted the accused, but made a mandatory medical examination compulsory before sentencing, and came to the conclusion that because they were of the view that he was suffering from some delusion, therefore he should not be given the death penalty. The truly interesting and landmark judgment of our times has been the judgment which was given by the Delhi High Court in Jitendra versus State, where the Delhi High Court actually, after looking into the entire gamut of decisions on the subject, took a very different view. In Jitendra's case, the allegations were that a son strangulated his 70-year-old father to death in the first floor of his own house, severed his head, and then other organs of the body, and then surrendered himself. Then went to 2 temples in the vicinity. He was prosecuted. While at the appellate stage, the division bench of the Delhi High Court upheld his conviction, they went to some lengths examining the aspect of sentence. And after having gone through all the decisions of the time, they came to the following finding in paragraph 76. They said the court is aware that in this case accused Jitendra did not enter the plea of insanity anytime during trial. And I'm going to be discussing this issue later on about why we hesitate to enter defenses like like insanity, why we hesitate to ask the court to call for the medical review of the defendant in question. But that notwithstanding, the Delhi High Court said it cannot help noticing that all circumstances point to his alienation from his surroundings, his family, near relatives, and others. The first thing that strikes one about the incident is not only the gory nature of the sacrifice, which incidentally appears to have horrified and perhaps overwhelmed the trial court from the first sentence of the impugned judgment, which refers to it as patricide, but also that the accused had to depend on legal aid. This court underscores the fact that because penury, destitution, poverty, illiteracy are barriers which accused often have to face when confronted with serious and often capital charges, when the crime is a ghastly one, the motive for which is based on superstitious belief in occult or black magic or the like, and the accused is disempowered for some reason, the court has to discharge a greater responsibility. What is being stated is that if there are such unusual or peculiar features in the allegations level which excite the suspicions of a judge at a preliminary stage, there is a possibility of the accused laboring under some mental disorder. The court should record so and send the accused for psychiatric or medical evaluation. It thereafter, in an interesting move, went on to commute the sentence to life imprisonment. But before parting, it said the courts hereby, that the Delhi High Court hereby directs that in all such cases of serious crimes, especially homicides where the accused are alleged to have indulged in unusual behavior, indicative of mental disorder or disturbance, especially in cases involving ritual killing or human sacrifice allegations which emerge from a reading of the FIR or statement of material witnesses, the magistrate taking cognizance of the offence shall refer the accused for suitable medical checkup to evaluate the possibility of his or her being or having been of a mental condition which might entitle him or her to avail the defence of insanity. This procedure is an integral component of legal aid, which every such potentially capitally charged accused is entitled to avail of. Such assistance and evaluation would also further the right of a fair trial under Article 21 of that class of accused who have no access to quality legal assistance or have no information of their entitlement to various defenses available in law. Now, as against this, we've had some disturbing judgments from the top court. The standout judgments is the one of Sushil Murmu versus State of Jharkhand, where the court, the Supreme Court, in a human sacrifice case, uses language which I find very frightening. It says, proportion between crime and punishment is a goal respected in principle. It remains a strong influence in determination of sentences. Anything less than the penalty of greatest severity for such serious crime is thought to be a measure of toleration that is unwarranted and unwise. But in fact, quite apart from those considerations that make punishment unjustifiable when it is out of proportion to the crime, uniformly disproportionate punishment has some very undesirable practical consequences. A bare look at the fact situation of this case shows that the appellant was not possessed of basic humanness, and he completely lacks the psyche or mindset which can be amenable for any transformation. He had, at the time of occurrence, a child of the same age as a victim, and yet he diabolically designed in a most dastardly and revolting manner to sacrifice a very hapless and helpless child of another for personal gain and to promote his fortunes by pretending to appease the deity. The brutality of the act is amplified by the grotesque and revolting manner in which the helpless child's head was severed. Even if the helpless and imploring fact and voice of the innocent child did not arouse any kind of kindness in the heart of the accused, the nonchalant way in which he carried the severed head in a gunny bag and threw it in a pond unerringly shows that the act was diabolical and cruel in execution. The tendency in the accused, and for that matter in anyone who entertains such revolting ideas, cannot be placed on a par with even an intention to kill someone, but really borders on a crime against humanity, indicative of the greatest depravity, shocking the conscience of not only any right-thinking person, but all courts as well. The socially abhorrent nature of the crime committed also ought not to be ignored in this case. If this act is not revolting or dastardly, it is beyond comprehension as to what other act can be so described, is the question. Superstition is a belief or notion not based on reason or knowledge, in or of the omnibus significance of a particular thing or circumstance, occurrence or the like, but mainly triggered by thoughts of self-aggrandizement and barbaric at times, as in the present case. Superstition cannot and does not provide justification for any killing, much less a planned and deliberate one. No amount of superstitious color can wash away the sin and offense of an unprovoked killing, more so in the case of an innocent and defenseless child. So Sushil Murmu really represents the complete lack of understanding that our top courts have when it comes to examining cases of this nature, particularly cases relating to human sacrifice. While reading judgments, I cannot help but read a judgment of one page, half a page judgment of Justice Krishna Iyer, where again, it's called Parasram and others versus State of Punjab. It's a 1980 judgment, where he says, this is again a case where I think a 4-year-old boy was sacrificed, and he says, one more observation relevant. In the first paragraph, he says, the offense of the general exception of 84 is not available. And then he says, one more observation relevant to the punishment. the poignantly pathological grip of macabre superstitions on some crude Indian minds in the shape of desire to do human and animal sacrifice in defiance of the scientific ethos of our cultural heritage and the scientific impact of our technological century shows up in crimes of primitive horror, such as the one we are dealing with now, where a blood-curdling butchery of one's own beloved son was perpetrated, aided by other pious criminals. A secular India speaking through the court must administer shock therapy to such anti-social piety when the manifestation is in terms of inhuman and criminal violence. When the disease is social, deterrence through court sentence must perforce operate through the individual culprit coming up before the court. Social justice has many facets. And judges have a sensitive and secular and civilizing role in suppressing grievous injustice to humanist views by inflicting punishment on dangerous deviants. In discharge of this high duty, we refuse special leave in these applications against the correct convictions and sentences of the court below. This is quite interesting. Parasram and others versus State of Punjab, 1981, 2